Hi, I'm Lisa from Lori's Country Cottage and welcome to How Tuesday. Today I'm going to show you how to make the Magic Tiles Quilt by Kathleen Bessette. Kathleen saw this block at her friend's house, but the instructions were too complicated, so she devised a mathematical formula and combined it with a technique from a Singer's sewing book and came up with the pattern Magic Tiles. This isn't a new pattern. It's been around almost as long as Lori's Country Cottage, but it is timeless. To make the quilt on the cover, all you need are 12 fat quarters and some fabric for the grout, which are the dark lines in between the fabrics. Go ahead and watch the videos and see how much fun it is to make magic tiles. Okay, let's make magic tiles. I've gathered my supplies. I've got 12 fat quarters. That will do me 12 blocks. I've got the fabric for my grout, or the lines in between everything. I've got my large ruler to help cut out large squares out of my fat quarters. I'm going to use a stripology ruler to cut lots of narrow strips from my grout fabric. And I have freezer paper to help make my pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my fat quarters, cut my grout, and prepare my pattern, and then I'll be back. All right, I've done my cutting. I have my 12 fat quarters cut into squares. I have my grout strips all cut. The next thing was to prepare the pattern piece. So I cut 2 pieces of freezer paper, the right size, and she just has you make a duplicate pattern in case you cut through your first pattern. So I'm just going to move one out of the way. The pattern is not specific. I simply followed her diagram in the pattern and I cut mine to look kind of like hers. So nothing specific. She tells you a few things not to do, don't cut out of the corner and whatnot. And then I labeled my 4 lines, A, B, C, and D, just like she suggested. And our first cut is going to be line A. So I'm just going to move my pattern or my fabric out of the way. And I'm going to use my ruler to help create that fold. She says to fold it out of the way. So I'm just going to make a fold there. That looks good. And then fold my pattern along that line. Went a little crooked. I'm just going to try that again. Maybe my fingernails will work just as good. There we go, that's better. Well, till I got there. All right, so now I have my pattern piece, and she says to always make sure that your fabrics remain right side up. Oh, also I labeled the fabric. Each one of the squares has a number, 1 through 12. Now I chose to use freezer paper because again I ironed it on and it'll just stick there. You could use flathead pins if you wanted, because you're going to want to lay your ruler on top. So she says to cut these one at a time, but life is short. So I'm going to cut 4 at a time. She doesn't say cut them one at a time. She says to make sure each one is cut. So I'm going to put my pattern piece on top, and I could, if I wanted, give this a light press and then it wouldn't move, but I'm pretty confident it's not going to move. All right, so that's lined up with my square. Now I'm just going to take my 24-inch ruler, lay it there, and be careful not to cut that paper pattern. That's why she had you make a second one. If you cut through this, you've ruined your pattern. So there's cut one. And I'm going to move this pile here. And I can see why it's important that they're numbered, because I need to put them back in order. Five, 6, 7, and 8 will be next. And again, my pattern piece on top. So I'll just continue cutting these, and then I will come back and show you the next step. Okay, I've cut all of my squares, and I've made sure they're in the same order. I can take my pattern piece off now. And also remember, it's important to label your block right in the middle. I sense we're going to be cutting around this number. So the next step is to add a grout strip to the top piece. And she suggests cutting the strips an inch longer than that length. So that length is 15.5. So I'm going to cut 12 16.5 strips out of my grout and sew the grout to all of these top pieces, and then put them back in the same order. When I'm done that, I'll come back and we'll move to the next step. All right, I've sewn my grout onto all of my top pieces and carefully pressed the seam allowance towards the grout, and then trimmed the excess off the sides. In the process of trimming, I found a couple blocks where I hadn't pressed really nice on the end, so I went back and pressed them. And now they're stacked in the right order, 1 through 12, with its partner 1 through 12. And so now we're going to do a shuffle. So the instructions say to use the top section that we sewed the grout on, take the top piece and move it to the bottom. There we go. And now I'm going to go sew the top pieces to the bottom pieces, creating a pieced block. So this will now become block number 1 when I sew that together. So I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to get those all done. All right, it's time for our next step. I've sewn the blocks all back together. They're still numbered 1 through 12. Now I take my pattern piece and fold it on line B. This time, because of all the seam allowances and the bulk of the blocks, I am going to cut one at a time. So I'm going to lay my pattern piece on top. Again, if you're having any trouble at all you have to do is take your iron and excuse me, press this down, and that will stick to your pattern. Make sure you don't cut your pattern piece. And go ahead and make that cut. Now I'm going to keep those in order. When I'm all done, I'm going to take a grout piece that's about an inch longer than this seam, and I'm going to sew all the grout onto this piece without the number, and then I'll be back. All right, I've got the grout on my pieces and I've pressed it so the seam allowance is against the grout. And this time she says not to trim the extra grout on the top and the bottom, and so I won't. And now it's time to do our next shifting of fabric. So from the fabric without the number, take the top 2 and put them on the bottom, keeping that order the same. And now I'm going to sew these right hand sections to the left hand sections, but I need to pin so that these grout marks line up. So I'm going to do that now, sew them together, and pin as I go and make sure everything lines up. Then we'll be back for the next step. Well, I'm back, and that was quick. I tried to line them up with pins, and I wasn't happy with the results. So I'm going to show you a method to make sure they line up. It's what I use when I'm trying to make sure sashing lines up. I'm going to take this line, this seam line, and give myself a little white mark in the sashing, and then I'll repeat that for the other side. Now, when I lay these right sides together, I can line my seam mark with those little white lines. And now I know everything will line up. Now I'm going to go and sew, and I'll be back. Here we are, all ready for the next step. I'm really pleased with how my grout lines lined up. I'm going to give you a close-up demo on how to do that when I hit that point in the next couple steps. So we're ready to cut line C. I've got my blocks 1 through 12. Nothing's been disorganized, all up in that direction. There's my pattern in the same direction, but I'm cutting this direction, this line C. So I'm going to shift my whole blocks like this so that I'm cutting how I cut with my rotary cutter. And I'm back to cutting one block at a time. Just with the bulk of the seam allowances, I don't know how accurate I would be if I tried to cut more than one at a time. So I folded on the C line, which remember looks like it's on the right hand side because we've turned all the blocks. It's actually the bottom line. Lined up my freezer paper. And then I'm going to give this a cut, and that'll be ready for the next step. All right, so there's that piece and this piece, and I'm going to continue to cut and pile my pieces up, and then I'm going to add grout just like the other steps to the piece that has no number. I'll add the grout, press toward the grout, and then when it's time to sew it back on, I'll come back and give you a close-up demo on how I line up these two lines when we sew them back together. All right, let's do another shuffle, and then I'll show you a close-up on lining up the grout when we sew them back together. But first, we need to do a shuffle. So this is the pile we just cut and sewed the grout to. Now the instructions say to take the top 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and to put them on the bottom. And now I need to sew these back together. So I'm just going to slide everything over. I'll take the top and the top. So I need to put these two together, but I want to make sure this line lines up. So here's how I do that. And I'll bring it close to the camera and show you as I do it. So I'm lining my ruler with this grout line and making a little white tick inside the seam allowance. So don't draw it across the whole grout, just at the seam allowance. All right. So there are my chalk lines right there, and you can see they're just outside the grout lines. So when I go to join this block, this right hand side to the rest of the block, I can look at those grout lines, line them up with the outside I have a pin in my mouth of the grout, and then pin before and after. Now, normally I wouldn't do this hanging in the air because those are bias seams, but that's what it looks like. And now when I stitch, the little white marks match up with my grout line, and then my blocks look perfect. So I'm going to stitch these blocks all together, and then I'll be back. All right, here we are again. We're getting close to our final steps. Now it's time to do our final D cut. I have my blocks numbered 1 through 12 right side up. My pattern is right side up, but because I'm going to cut like this, I'm going to take my whole set, make sure you turn the pattern at the same time, and turn it upside down. Take my top block, number 1. I just love how these look. Line up my pattern piece. Looks great. Again, don't forget, if you're having trouble with your pattern piece, go ahead and press it lightly with your iron and it'll stick down. And again, I'm cutting one at a time. You know you're cutting the right place because there's no number on here. The number is always underneath. We're creating a piece without the number. So there's my final cut. I'm going to continue cutting the rest of these pieces. I'm going to take the grout, stitch it on here, press it with the seam allowance toward the grout. Then I'll come back for the final shuffle and some special notes on joining this last piece. Pay special attention in the next video. Your blocks should look like this when starting, except your block number 1 will be on top. I didn't see my error until it was too late to go back and reshoot the video. So, for the next step, before you shuffle, your fabrics should be the same, but your fabric number 1 should be on top. All right, move on to the next video, but remember, my fabrics are in the wrong order. I caught it later, but save yourself some trouble. Make sure your fabrics are lined up like this. You've simply cut and put the grout in between, stack them up with number 1 on top, and then continue on with my next video. All right, here we are, ready for our last shuffle. I've left my blocks upside down so that I can work on the right-hand side. We're going to take the top 7 layers now and shuffle them to the bottom. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Put them on the bottom and move this to the top. Wow, it looks like I did everything right. I don't have any matching fabrics in here. I'm so relieved. All right, so our last step to get our blocks together is again to join this to this. But beware, there are 2 grout lines we need to match now. So I'm going to mark both lines, pin both lines, sew them together, and then we get to square up our blocks. All right, my blocks are finished. It's time to square them up. They should be 15-inch blocks, and mine are pretty square, but remember we've left our grout hanging off. So you always need to square up your blocks when you're done piecing a block. So grab your largest square if you're lucky to have a 15-inch square. Lucky you. But I'm going to use my 20.5-inch square. And there are no vertical or horizontal straight lines to use. So you're just going to cut the biggest. I just want to barely trim here and here. And then my next cut actually squares it up. So just barely trimming. I think I can get a bit more off of that on either side, because my blocks are just the right size. And then flip your block And now we'll use the 15-inch lines and actually square up the block. So now I'm using the lines here to completely square up my block. And mine are just slightly smaller than 15. They'll be 14 7/8 because I really like to trim a little bit off, so that's what I've done. So there's my beautiful completed block. I'm going to go ahead and trim the rest of my blocks down to 14 7/8 in my size, or 15 inches if yours are the full size. And then we're going to do a layout. I'll lay them out, making sure that I don't put two colors kind of together. And it doesn't matter if my blocks are this way or this way. We won't be matching any seams because there's grout in between, but I don't want to lay my blocks so that something like this is touching. So I probably wouldn't use this one because that's too close. But that would be okay, even though this fabric is in this block, is also here, but it's far away, and these don't have the same fabric. So I'm going to lay my blocks out 3 across by 4 down, get that all organized, and then I'll show you how to put the grout in between the blocks. All right, I'm going to use the pattern cover as a form of illustration for how we're going to put this sashing in, because she doesn't really give instructions. She just says sash it with the grout fabric. So I've cut a bunch of 1-inch strips using my Stripology ruler, and here is the order and the process for adding the sashing. I laid my blocks out on my living room floor and got them all organized, and my blocks, even though mine are 14 7/8, we're going to call them 15-inch blocks, okay? So I've cut 8 15-inch strips of grout for block 1, block 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So on the right hand side of block 1, right hand side of block 2 for these 8 blocks. Now I can join this block to the grout on this block and do that for all 4 rows. And then I can add this block to the grout on this block. Do that for all 4 rows. And now you have 3 complete rows of tiles with the grout in between. So to put those together, we're going to cut the strip the same length as our row and attach one to the top and to the bottom of row 1. And then the bottom of row 2, the bottom of row 3, and the bottom of row 4. And now you can attach row 2 to the grout of row 1, row 3 to the grout of row 2, and row 4 to the grout of row 3. And now we have the center quilt completed except for these 2 lengths of grout. So measure the length of your quilt top at this point, outside, middle, and left-hand side. Piece your grout, cut it the average of those 3 measurements, and sew it on to both sides. And then the center of our quilt will be complete. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Then we'll come back and talk about borders. I will mention also, if your brain works in the opposite direction, instead of working this way, you want to work up and down, you can certainly do that. It's the same process, just tilted. You would add the grout here, 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 and here, and work in the opposite direction. All right, I'm back. The center of my quilt is done, and I love it. I love it. It was so much fun to do. But now I want to put on the optional decorative border. So gather all your leftover strips and fabric. She doesn't give you a dimension to cut. Do whatever you like. Not thinking ahead, I cut 3 inches. I have just enough fabric to do my borders. If I would have cut 2.5, I'd have a lot more. So just plan it out ahead of time how wide to cut your strips. So I've taken my leftover fabric, cut everything into 3-inch strips. And you have smaller pieces. So now it's time to build the borders. So with this decorative border, what she does is you do a top and bottom border and left and right border like usual, but you want the top corner to have the same fabric, same with the other corner. So on our strip, my first border, I measured my quilt, it was about 46 by 60. So I need to build 2 approximately 60-inch lengths for the length of my quilt and 2 approximate 46-inch borders for the top and the bottom. But we need to do a little bit of planning. So my first long border starts with this green print and ends with the blue. So this will be on one long end of my quilt. So my next short border needs to start with blue so that they meet on the corner. So that I go blue to this nice white, and then I have white here coming to the small green print. So my next strip needs to start with the small green strip, and it needs to end with the large green print so that they match in the corner. So I'll just show you the method for doing this. So starting with, I'm actually going to end with the green because my brain just works that way. So start with my green print, and I need at least 60 inches approximately. And I just kind of look at what fabrics do I have left over and make sure I vary them as I go. So maybe a light and then the dark green, then a blue, and then I'm ending with the green that goes there. So now when I piece my borders on, it'll have the same fabric at the top, and we're able to play as we go along. So what I've done is I've overlapped the fabrics about 1 inch. And we're gonna do some fancy cutting. Remember, your leftover little blue strips, we're going to use those. But here's how we're going to do our borders. I'm gonna work in the middle so it's easier for you to see. My strips are overlapped about 1 inch. I'm going to take my ruler and just make a diagonal cut. It doesn't matter what the angle is, just making sure that you catch both fabrics. So take that and take this off. And now I have a diagonal cut, and I'm going to piece in one of my blue pieces. I was somewhat methodical about making sure I didn't go like this, and then this, and this, and this, because then it looks like you're trying to match it. And if you do something different at some point, then it looks like you didn't do it right. So this one I'm going to go the same direction for no good reason whatsoever, except to not do it exactly the same each way. And then when you're done, just pin them together so that they stay in the right order, and then we can add the little blue strips. So this one, so I've gone this way and this way. I think I'm going to go this way again. This one's already cut on this angle, so I'm going to continue. And make sure you give it a nice angle. You don't really want anything straight across. Again, because if it ends up not being straight across, it looks like you didn't quite do it right. All right, so I'm going to continue that. Then I'm going to have 4 border strips all pinned and ready to go. And I'm going to take my leftover little blue strips and sew it at each of these pinned places. Then my border will be longer, and then I can put them on the quilt, making sure that I plan out that my corners match. I can move my borders up and down left or right. If it's way too long, I could come in and adjust the size of this green strip simply by picking it away from the blue, cutting it off, and sewing it back on. So I'm going to piece my borders, and then I'm going to put them on the quilt, and then I'll be back. Well, I've got both my borders on, and you can see how the white goes around the corner, and so does the pretty blue printed fabric. Then I simply added borders around the outside with the same color as my grout. This was a great fun project to make, and I really enjoyed how it showcases the fabric. You have nice big pieces, and if you have a line of fabric that you like the whole line, this is a great way to put it all together. I hope you enjoyed watching me make magic tiles. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make magic tiles. And here's a little tip. The grout strips are only 1 inch wide, so finished at 1/2 inch. When you're sewing on the first seam on the grout, it's super easy, no problem. But if you're having problems attaching the second seam to that narrow strip because your presser foot is hitting the seam allowance, go ahead and put on an open-toed foot or a different foot. Use a seam guide to adjust your needle to the scant 1/4 inch and you'll have no problems. Thanks for joining me for How To'sDay.